A shy maid greeted the vampire king's father. Her greeting, in a forgotten dialect, left him in shock. What does it take to make a man who has lived 700 years weep? Not war, not loss, not the slow death of everyone he ever loved. A 22-year-old girl. 6 words. A language dead for 4 centuries. Veil Manor did not appear on any map that ordinary people used. It rose from the earth at the far edge of London's fog belt. Gothic arches pressed against modern glass. Ivy swallowing the eastern stones so completely the house looked less like a home and more like something the dark had quietly decided to keep. Inside, amber sconces burned day and night, because the people who lived here had no particular use for sunlight. Freya Hale had taken 3 trains and a bus to reach it. She was 22, 5'3", carrying a canvas backpack with a change of clothes, a small jar of heather honey from her grandmother's pantry, and one photograph she no longer let herself look at too often. She had grown up in a Scottish Highlands village so remote it had no coffee shop, only fog, sheep, her grandmother's kitchen, and stories told in a language no one else in her world seemed to know. She had answered the job posting because the pay was generous and the instructions were simple. Clean Lord Valerian Voss's private study each morning at precisely 7:30. Turn on the vintage heating system, organize the documents, and do not touch anything on the east shelf. Mrs. Alara Crow, the housekeeper, had studied her during the interview the way someone studies a letter written in a language they almost recognize. Then, "You'll do," granted like a small, uncertain mercy on her 3rd morning. Freya found a child's drawing tucked beneath the leg of the writing desk. The paper had gone the color of old cream. 2 figures beneath a moon, one tall with white hair, one small. Reaching up to hold their hand, she placed it gently on the corner of the desk without disturbing anything else. That evening, she noticed it had been laid face down in the top drawer. She never said a word, neither did anyone else. But every morning after, as she moved through that cold, high-ceilinged room, adjusting the brass lamp, straightening the ink bottles, nudging the heating dial to the temperature marked on the instruction card, she thought about what it must feel like to keep a drawing like that hidden away, to have once been the smaller figure reaching upward, to have lived so long that even your grief had grown old. "I'm just a shy girl from the mountains," she told herself each morning. "Like a quiet piece of armor. I'm here to clean, nothing more." On the morning of November 12th, Freya arrived 6 minutes early. She was reaching up to straighten the top shelf, leather-bound journals. Spines faded to near nothing, when the door opened without a knock. Lord Valerian Voss filled the doorway the way a winter storm fills a window, completely, and without apology. Tall, white-haired, lean in the way centuries of rigid control make a person lean, as though everything unnecessary had long since been stripped away. His eyes were old silver. The air around him dropped several degrees. Freya turned, bowed her head, and from somewhere deep in the back of her memory, her grandmother's kitchen, a dying fire, a voice saying these are the old words, the proper words, the ones that still carry weight. Something surfaced without her permission. She spoke. "May the eternal night guard your dawn, my lord." The room stopped breathing. Lord Valerian's face, unchanged for 7 centuries, cracked open like ice under sudden pressure. His eyes flared red for half a second. When he finally spoke, the voice that came out did not belong to a man of power. It belonged to a man who had just heard a ghost say his name. "You, where did you learn that?" Then lower, rougher. "Leave." Now. Freya left. Her pulse was loud in her ears, not from fear, from something she couldn't yet name. She did not know that in the East Wing, a pair of silver-gray eyes had watched everything through a hidden camera. That the man watching had not moved in 3 full minutes. That somewhere inside 4 centuries of practiced stillness, something had just come loose. She had no idea that everything was about to change. Lord Valerian told her to leave. But do you think Freya should have stayed and explained herself? Or was leaving the right call? Drop your answer. Stay or leave in the comments. And stay with us, because what happens next in that hallway will change everything you think you know about this house. Nobody mentioned the incident. Not Mrs. Crow, who handed Freya her morning schedule the next day, with the same flat efficiency as always. Not Lord Valerian, who was absent from his study every morning that followed, the desk left exactly as she had arranged it, untouched, as if he had not been inside at all. Not the house itself, which simply went on breathing its cold amber light through the hallways, while Freya went on cleaning. She told herself that was fine. Preferred, even. She straightened the ink bottles. She did not look at the east shelf, and she did not think about the way Lord Valerian's voice had fractured on that single word, leave, pressed out like something that cost him more than he had intended to spend. She was a maid. She was here to clean. That was the whole of it. On the 5th morning, she was replacing a burnt-out bulb in the study's brass lamp when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Unhurried, deliberate. Nothing like the swift, silent movements of the other household staff. She recognized the weight of them before she saw him. Adrien Voss stepped into the doorway. He appeared no older than his mid-30s, dark-haired, eyes the color of pewter on a winter morning. He moved like someone who had spent 4 centuries learning how to take up exactly as much space as a room required, and no more. He looked at Freya the way you look at something you have already decided is not your concern, but cannot quite stop watching. "You're the one from the Highlands," he said. Not a question. "Yes, my lord." A pause. His gaze moved briefly to the east shelf. A habitual check. Automatic as breathing. Then back to her. "My father has requested that you continue your morning schedule without modification." Another pause. Consider that a significant statement from a man who has not made requests of household staff in 60 years. He left before she could respond. Freya stood very still in the middle of the room, the new bulb cool in her palm. He didn't fire me, she thought. He actually didn't fire me. It began with 4 o'clock. On the 9th day, Mrs. Crow appeared at the far end of the east corridor and gestured, once, without a word, toward the small sitting room adjacent to Lord Valerian's study. A room Freya had cleaned but never entered while occupied. Inside, a low fire burned in the grate. A single chair had been positioned near it. Across from it, in the tall wingback that faced the window, Lord Valerian sat with a book open across his knee, and a cup of something dark and steaming beside him that Freya chose not to examine too closely. He did not look up when she entered. "Sit," he said. She sat. For several minutes. Neither of them spoke. The fire ticked. Outside, a thin November rain began to trace lines down the window glass. Then, without lifting his eyes from the page, "You grew up in the Highlands." "Yes, my lord. A village called Ardvar. Most people have never heard of it." "I have." She looked at him. He turned a page. "It was called something different then," he said. "The valley had another name. There was a woman there who kept a small garden on the north side of the hill despite the frost. That was approximately 380 years ago. Freya thought of the honey jar in her backpack. Heather honey. From the north side hill above her grandmother's house. She thought about saying this. She did not. My grandmother told me stories about that valley, she said instead. She said our family had lived there longer than anyone could trace. Lord Valerian finally looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Not warmth, not yet, but the distant forerunner of it. The sky before the sun arrives. She also taught you the greeting, he said. She called it the language that carries things correctly. A long silence. The fire popped. The rain came harder. She was right, he said at last, and turned back to his book. Freya walked back to her room that evening, with the conversation turning in her hands, like a stone she had found on a path. Smooth, heavier than it looked, clearly belonging to somewhere very old. She found Adrien in the library on the 11th evening. He was standing with his back to the door, studying a portrait she had noticed before but never looked at directly. A woman painted in oils, her dark hair loose, her expression carrying the particular stillness of someone listening for something just outside the frame. The paint was old. The eyes were warm in a way that did not quite fit the formality of the pose. She was kind, Adrien said, without turning. Dangerously so. My father always said it was her greatest flaw. Freya stood in the doorway. It doesn't look like a flaw from here, she said quietly. Adrien turned. He looked at her with an expression she could not fully read. Something caught halfway between recognition and resistance. You should be careful, he said, about the things you say in this house. I've been told, she said. I keep saying them anyway. She left. Behind her. She heard nothing. No footsteps, no movement. Only the particular quality of silence that belongs to a person who has stopped mid-thought and not yet decided what to do next. By the second week, 4 o'clock had become a fixed point in both their days. Though no one said so aloud, Lord Valerian began talking. Not much. A sentence here, a paragraph there, but steadily. The way a frozen pipe begins to move water once the temperature shifts by just enough. He spoke of Helena in careful fragments. Not her death. Never that yet. Only small things. The way she had pronounced certain words. The particular angle at which she held her head when she was thinking. A recipe for something warm she had made every November that he had never been able to replicate. Freya listened the way her grandmother had taught her to listen, with her full body still and her full attention present, not filling silence with reassurance, not rushing toward comfort he had not asked for. One afternoon, she brought the heather honey from her room and set the small jar on the table between them without explanation. She did not say, "This was my grandmother's." She did not say, "I have been carrying this since before I understood why." She set it down. That was enough. Lord Valerian looked at it for a long time. When he finally picked it up, he held it the way you hold something that might not be real if you grip it too hard. Helena made preserves every autumn from that same valley, he said. His voice perfectly controlled, his eyes not. She said the heather there grew from old ground that remembered things. Freya said nothing. She thought, a language that was supposed to be dead. A jar of honey that crossed 380 years without either of us knowing. Grandmother, what exactly did you send me into on the 14th night? Freya heard Mrs. Crow's sharp intake of breath from the corridor. She opened her door. The housekeeper was leaning against the wall, one hand pressed to her left side, her face drawn pale beneath its usual composure. An old wound. Freya could see it immediately. The way the tissue had never healed cleanly. I'm fine, Mrs. Crow said, in a tone that indicated she was not fine and found the question irritating. Freya guided her to the alcove chair anyway and simply talked about the village, the fog, the sheep clustering near the stone walls before weather came in. Her grandmother's hands, rough and certain, pressing warmth into everything they touched. After a while, Mrs. Crow's breathing steadied. She looked down at her arm. The skin at the wound's edge had begun to close. Faster, visibly faster, than it should have. She looked at Freya, then at the place where Freya's fingers had rested briefly against her wrist. Child, she said softly, every edge gone from her voice. You have no idea what you carry. Freya opened her mouth. Down the hall, a door opened. Adrien stood in the frame, fully dressed despite the hour, his eyes moving from Mrs. Crow to Freya and back. His expression did not change, but something shifted beneath it, something that looked, very briefly, like fear. Not fear of Freya, fear for her. He said nothing. He closed his door quietly, as though he had not been there at all. Freya sat in the alcove long after Mrs. Crow had gone to bed. She turned those 4 words over in the dark. You have no idea. She had heard something like them once before, in her grandmother's kitchen, on the last night before the old woman died. A sentence started and then stopped, as though the timing was not right. Freya had been 16. She had not thought about it again until now, 3 days after the night in the corridor. Lord Valerian did not come to 4 o'clock. Freya sat in the small sitting room for 11 minutes before accepting that the chair across from her was going to stay empty. The fire burned. The rain tapped the window. The cup of plain black tea she had brought sat cooling on the side table, untouched. She went back to her room and did not mention it to anyone. The next afternoon, she did not go at all. The morning after that, Mrs. Crow handed her the schedule with a single modification. The study would now be cleaned at 9 o'clock, not 7:30. No explanation was given. The east corridor felt entirely different at 9. The amber sconces cast the same light. The ink bottles were in the same order. The heating dial was already set when she arrived. As if someone had come through before her. Someone had. She stood in the middle of the room and understood, with the particular clarity of a person who has been quietly excluded before. She was being managed. The honey jar was gone from the sitting room table. The wingback chair had been turned to face the window. She straightened the ink bottles that did not need straightening. She turned the heating dial 1 degree and turned it back. She left at 9:17 without looking at the library door, which was now closed. She noticed the small absences, the way you notice the absence of a sound you had not realized you were listening for. The sitting room fire, which Mrs. Crow had lit every afternoon regardless of season, was not lit. Through the gap under the door, no warm light, no ticking grate, no faint smell of old paper that Freya had stopped registering weeks ago because it had simply become part of what the house smelled like when it felt, cautiously, like home. On the 4th day of the new schedule, she passed Adrien in the main hall. He did not stop. He did not look at her with the complicated, watchful attention she had grown accustomed to. He looked at her the way you look at someone you have made a decision about. "Good morning," Freya said, because her grandmother had taught her that silence in the face of dismissal was its own kind of agreement. "Miss Hale," he said, and kept walking. She stood in the hall long after his footsteps had faded. Miss Hale. A formal title applied like a polite barrier. The thing you call someone when you have decided they do not get to be a person to you anymore. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the photograph of her grandmother. Standing at the kitchen door of the Ardvar house, one hand raised against the morning light, the heather hill rising behind her. What did you send me into? She thought. And why didn't you tell me what I was carrying? On the fifth evening, a note appeared under her door, one handwritten line, in ink as dark and precise as everything else in this house. Come to the sitting room at 8. Come alone. She went. The fire was lit. Lord Valerian's chair faced inward. The honey jar was back in its corner of the table. He stood at the window with his back to her. The fog had come in early. Veil Manor's grounds had dissolved into gray. Sit down, Freya. It was the first time he had used her name. She sat. She waited. What I am about to tell you, he said, still facing the window, I have told no one in 400 years. Not my son, not Mrs. Crow, not the council. I am telling you because you are the only person alive with the right to hear it, and because I have run out of time to keep pretending otherwise. He turned. His face was the one she had come to know over 3 weeks of afternoons. Controlled, carved by centuries into something that had stopped showing what it had not decided to show. But tonight the control had slipped by 1 degree. His eyes were not silver. They were the deep, exhausted gray of a man who has been carrying something enormous and has finally, irrevocably, decided to put it down. Your grandmother, he said, was not Helena's distant cousin. He picked up the honey jar, held it in both hands. She was the 11th generation direct descendant of Helena Voss's younger sister, the only branch of the Nocturne pure bloodline to survive the Hunter Council's purge of 1624. His voice did not waver. The line was hidden deliberately, scattered through human families in the highlands so the council could never trace it. Every generation was taught only what the previous one decided was safe to carry. A greeting, a language, a jar of honey from the right hill. He looked at her, just enough to find their way back when the time came. Freya's mouth was dry. Back to what? Back here. His voice fractured. Barely. A hairline crack in 400 years of stone. The purest blood always comes home. And now only one remains. Silver gathered at the corners of his eyes. That is you, Freya. You are the last. The fire crackled. Outside. The fog moved against the glass like something breathing. Freya did not move. She did not cry. The information was too large. The shape of it too strange for an ordinary response. She looked at the honey jar. She thought about her grandmother pressing it into her backpack that last morning. Not explaining, just closing the zipper carefully. Then holding Freya's face in both hands for a long moment before letting go. She thought about the child's drawing. 2 figures beneath a moon, one small, reaching upward. Helena, she thought. That was Helena. You sacrificed her, Freya said quietly. To save the bloodline. You let the council take her and you didn't stop it. Lord Valerian did not deny it. He set the honey jar down. His hands rested on the arms of the chair with perfect stillness. The stillness of a man who has finished arguing with his own guilt and arrived somewhere worse. Beyond argument, where you simply live with what you chose. I thought survival was the same thing as preservation, he said. I was wrong, and I have had 400 years to understand exactly how wrong. Freya leaned forward. Her voice was not angry. It was the voice of someone who has just understood something enormous and is deciding, in real time, what to do with the weight of it. She said the old nocturne greeting again, but changed one word. May the eternal night guard your morning, my lord. Lord Valerian closed his eyes. A tear traced the line of his jaw. The first. She understood. In 4 centuries. In the East Wing. Adrien watched it happen through a hidden camera, watched the girl from the Highlands sit with his father and not try to fix it or fill it or rush it. Just sit with it. His hand was flat against the desk. His jaw was tight. He had known about the bloodline for weeks. He had known what Freya was from the morning he first caught her scent in the hallway. He had said nothing, told himself it was caution, called it management. Watching his father weep for the first time in 4 centuries. He could no longer call it that, and in that moment, he understood the terrible truth. He had been protecting the secret, but he had never once asked whether Freya deserved to be protected from it. She did not sleep that night. She lay on her back in the narrow staff bed and went over it the way her grandmother had taught her to go over hard things. Not avoiding, not rushing, but turning each piece carefully until you could see its true shape. The bloodline, the hidden language, the honey from the North Hill. The grandmother who had packed it into her bag and said nothing beyond, "Be careful, and you'll know the right words when you need them." She had spent 22 years believing she was simply different. A girl who knew a dead language, who felt things a fraction too intensely, and had learned early to hold most of it back. She had believed the ache she carried, for belonging, for somewhere that fit the particular shape of her, was ordinary loneliness, the kind everyone had, the kind you learned to live around. It had never occurred to her that the ache was a compass, that every story, every word of the old language pressed into her memory, every jar of honey from the North Side heather, all of it had been a map, drawn in pieces and handed down through 11 generations of women who had known the destination, but trusted none of their daughters with the full address. They were taught just enough to find their way back. She picked up the photograph from the nightstand, her grandmother at the kitchen door, one hand raised against the morning light. "You could have told me," she thought. "You had years." But even as she thought it, she understood. Some truths, named too early, become the very thing that destroys what they were meant to protect. Her grandmother had kept the secret the same way Freya had kept quiet in this house. Because care, sometimes, looks exactly like silence. She protected me the only way she knew how. And now I have to decide what to do with what she gave me. 2 floors above. Adrien sat at his desk in the East Wing with the lights off. He had been in the dark for an hour. On his secondary screen, the camera feeds showed the sitting room. Fire burned low. Honey jar still on the table. And Freya's corridor. No movement under the door. He had known from the first morning. Her scent had told him everything. Ancient blood, pure and unmistakable, running just beneath the surface of a girl who carried a canvas backpack and left child's drawings exactly where she found them. He had told himself it was a security matter, a variable requiring observation. He had maintained his distance and called it professionalism, the appropriate behavior of a king managing a risk. He had told himself this for 3 weeks. He was no longer telling himself this. What he was telling himself now was harder. He had kept her in the dark because knowledge was power, and power was the only thing he had trusted completely for 4 centuries. He had watched her sit with his father every afternoon, watched her bring the honey, watched her hold Mrs. Crow's wrist and talk about fog and sheep, while a wound that had not moved in 40 years quietly began to close. He had watched all of it and called it management. She is the first person, he thought, who has made me afraid of my own choices. She found him in the library the next morning, not by accident. She had decided somewhere around 3 in the morning that she was done waiting for the house to decide when she was allowed to ask questions. Adrien was standing at the window with his back to her. She crossed the room and stopped in front of Helena's portrait. "I know you knew," she said. "Before your father told me. I know you could tell from the beginning." The fog pressed against the glass. "Yes," Adrien said. One word. Flat and clean. The sound of a man who has decided that a particular kind of dishonesty costs too much to maintain. "Why didn't you tell me?" He turned. His eyes were unguarded. She had learned by now that this was what he looked like when he had stopped managing what showed in them. Because knowing what you are would have made you a target the moment that knowledge left this room. He stopped. And I was not ready for that. Not ready for what? He looked at the honey jar on the table behind her. She had carried it here without thinking, the way she had been carrying it since she arrived, the way her grandmother had pressed it into her hands at the door. "Not ready," he said, "for something I cannot afford to lose." Freya looked at him steadily. "I'm not Helena," she said. "I'm not a debt you owe your father. And I'm not a bloodline for you to guard from a distance." A pause. "I'm just Freya, from the Highlands. And I think you already know that." Something in his jaw shifted. He looked at Helena's portrait, at those warm, painted eyes that had been listening for 4 centuries, then back at her. "You're the first person who has ever said to me exactly the thing I could not say to myself." It was not a grand moment. No declarations, no sudden breaking. He crossed the room and stood in front of her. She held her ground. Neither of them spoke for a long time. He was close enough that she could feel the cold that lived in him. Centuries of chosen distance made into climate. She felt it and did not step back. Most people stepped back. She had noticed that about this house. Everyone kept a careful inch between themselves and whatever mattered most. She was done doing that. His hand came up, hesitated, then rested, barely, against the side of her face. Less a touch than a question. Freya felt it. Warmth moving through the bloodline like a current finding its channel. She reached up and covered his fingers with hers, and she saw it. Not a vision exactly, but something carried in the contact. A flash of firelight. A woman with dark hair and warm eyes. A young man standing at the edge of a decision he could not undo. A door closed. A name never spoken again. She understood what that choice had cost, what 400 years of carrying it looked like from the inside. She did not pull her hand away. "I know what your father saw that night," she said. "I know what it cost him. I'm not asking you to carry that, too." Adrien's eyes closed. When they opened, they were clear. Not watchful, not controlled. Simply clear. "I know," he said quietly. "I've known since the first morning." Freya took her hand back slowly. She set the honey jar on the table in its corner. The same deliberate placement that had become, between them, a language of its own. Something neither of them had named, but both of them understood. For the first time in her life, the ache she had always carried felt less like a wound and more like a door she had just decided to walk through. For the first time since arriving at Veil Manor, she knew what she had to do. Don't go anywhere. What Freya does next with that choice will change everything for this family, in ways none of them expected. She went to Lord Valerian first. It was not yet 7. The amber sconces still on their night setting, the house holding its particular pre-dawn silence. She did not knock. She stood at the door of the sitting room and waited, not pushing, not retreating, just present. The door opened from inside. Lord Valerian looked at her for a moment without speaking. In the gray morning light, he appeared exactly what he was. A man who had carried something enormous for a very long time, and had recently set part of it down. Still adjusting to the unfamiliar lightness, "You came back," he said. "I didn't leave," Freya said. He stepped aside. She came in. The fire was not yet lit. She went to the grate and lit it herself, the same way she had watched Mrs. Crow do it a dozen times, carefully, from the bottom. Then she opened the honey jar and set it on the table between the two chairs. Not placed this time. Opened. Lord Valerian sat across from her. They watched the fire take hold, the small orange light strengthening, pushing the gray back toward the edges of the room. "Tell me about her," Freya said. "Not what happened, just who she was." He looked at the fire for a long time. "She laughed at things that weren't funny," he said finally, "and found no humor whatsoever in things everyone else considered amusing. She had an opinion about every piece of music she had ever heard and was entirely willing to share it, whether or not anyone had asked. She kept that garden in every kind of weather." A pause. "She told me once that the measure of a life was not its length." She was 23 when she said it. Another pause. Quieter. "She was right, of course. She generally was." Freya listened the way her grandmother had taught her. Body still, attention fully present. Not filling the silence with reassurance. Not rushing toward comfort he had not asked for. The smell of heather drifted up from the open jar between them, warm and faintly sweet. The smell of the Northside Hill in autumn, carried through 11 generations to arrive, finally, in this room. Lord Valerian reached out and touched the rim of the jar. "Thank you," he said, "for not letting me keep the drawer closed." Adrien found them there at 8:30. He stood in the doorway. Freya looked up. Lord Valerian looked at his son with the expression of a father who had spent centuries receiving careful distance and was not yet certain what to do now that it was gone. Adrien came in. He sat, not in a third chair. There was not one. He sat on the low stool near the grate, the one kept for tending the fire, and he did not appear to find this remarkable. Freya looked at the two of them and thought, without meaning to, about the child's drawing. Two figures beneath a moon, one reaching up. "Mrs. Crow's arm has healed completely," Adrien said, to no one in particular. "She won't explain how. I suspect she has decided it is not worth the conversation." A small silence. "She told me I don't know what I carry," Freya said. "You know more than you did 3 weeks ago," Lord Valerian said. "That's not the same thing as knowing." "No," he agreed, "but it is where every true thing begins." He glanced at Adrien. Brief, direct. The look of a man who has decided to stop being careful about what his face shows. Helena used to say that understanding yourself was the only journey with no fixed destination. She found this very exciting. The faintest compression at the corner of his mouth, the shape a smile would take in a face relearning how to make one. I found it exhausting. I have since revised my position. "Your father just said something wise," Freya said to Adrien. "He does that occasionally," Adrien said. "I try not to encourage it." Lord Valerian made a sound. Freya was almost certain it was a laugh. Small, rusty, 4 centuries out of practice. But a laugh, she thought. There it is. That is what this house has been waiting to hear. Not resolution, not forgiveness, just this. One old man, caught off guard by someone who refused to be managed, laughing. Later, after Lord Valerian had gone to rest, Freya and Adrien stood together in the library. The morning fog had finally broken. thin December light moved slowly across the room. Helena's portrait looked different in it. Less like a ghost and more like a record. Evidence of someone who had been here, mattered, and left a mark that had outlasted everything that tried to erase it. She would have liked you, Adrien said. You never met her, Freya said. No, but I know what my father was before she died, and what he became afterward. The difference is its own kind of portrait. A pause. You have given him something I spent 400 years trying to give and never could. Freya thought about this. You were trying to fix it, she said. That's different from just staying in it with someone. Something shifted in Adrien's face. The recognition of a person hearing a true thing said plainly, without softening. Yes, he said. That is exactly the difference. She reached up and straightened Helena's portrait. Barely off level. A fraction. The kind of thing only someone who had spent weeks learning this room's angles would notice. The same quiet attention she had given to every small thing in this house since the morning she arrived. Adrien watched her do it. Then he reached out and took her hand. Not a question this time, not a hesitation. His hand, cold and steady, closing around hers. Her hand, warm, closing back. They stood in front of Helena's portrait while the light moved across the room and the fire ticked quietly in the grate. Freya thought about 11 generations of women carrying honey jars down Northside Hills, about her grandmother pressing the bag closed at the door, about a language that was supposed to be dead, and how it had crossed 4 centuries of silence and landed, finally, in the right room. This is what she was sending me toward, she thought. Not a house, not a bloodline. This. The moment of very old grief finally has someone willing to stay with it long enough for it to change its shape. Walking the east corridor back toward the main hall, she noticed it. The amber sconces, which had always burned with the warmth of something compensating for absence, felt different now. The same light, the same fixtures, but the hallway felt inhabited rather than preserved. Mrs. Crow was at the far end, clipboard in hand, until she looked up and saw Freya. She held her gaze for a moment with an expression that belonged entirely to a person, and not at all to a housekeeper. A single small nod. Freya nodded back. The house felt different now. Not because the grief had dissolved, not because 4 centuries of held pain had simply resolved itself, but because something had shifted in the architecture of it. The rooms were the same, but they were no longer rooms that had forgotten they were meant to be lived in. Something had come home. Stay for the final part, because on the last night before Freya leaves for the Highlands, something happens that neither of them will ever be able to explain. On the last morning of December, Freya woke before 5 and could not go back to sleep. She got up, went to the kitchen, and made 2 cups of tea, plain black, the kind her grandmother had made every morning of her life. She carried them down the east corridor and knocked at the sitting room door. Lord Valerian opened it. He looked at the cups. He stepped aside. They sat by the fire in the dark before dawn, and Freya did something she had not done in all the weeks of 4 o'clock afternoons. She asked him to teach her. The language, she said. The parts my grandmother didn't pass down. I want to learn them. Lord Valerian held his cup in both hands. There is a great deal of it, he said. I know. A pause. The fire settled. Helena was a faster learner than you will be, he said, with the particular tone of a man who is aware he is being difficult and has decided this is how he shows affection. She had a better ear. You don't know that yet, Freya said. The compression at the corner of his mouth completed itself. A small, quiet, 400-year absent smile. "No," he said. "I suppose I don't." Adrien found her in the library at 9. She was at the top shelf, taking down the leather-bound journals one by one, reading the faded spines in the morning light. "Those are my father's," he said from the doorway. "He told me to look at them." She drew out the narrow, dark red one she had been searching for, binding cracked along the spine, the most handled of the row. She opened it to the first page. Inside, in a precise old hand, November 16, 43. Beneath it, 3 lines in old nocturne. She looked up. "He started that journal the month after Helena died," Adrien said quietly. "He wrote in it every November for 60 years. Then he stopped." Freya looked at the page. She traced the first line with one finger, not touching the ink, just following the shape of it. "He's going to start again," she said. Not a prediction, a fact she had already decided to make true. She closed the journal. She climbed the step and replaced it on the shelf. Not at the end of the row where it had been, but at the front, within easy reach. The same unhurried care she had given to every small thing in this house since the morning she arrived with a canvas backpack and 6 words she had not known would matter. Small things. She had learned that about grief. It did not yield to grand gestures. It yielded to small things, done consistently, without asking for acknowledgement. Adrien watched her do it. Then he crossed the room and stood beside her. Neither of them spoke. They looked at Helena's portrait together, at those warm, painted eyes, still listening for something just outside the frame. She can rest now, Freya thought. She's been waited for long enough, and she finally understood what her grandmother had carried for 11 generations of women, and had pressed into a backpack with a jar of honey and 3 words, "You'll know when," rather than an explanation. It was not the bloodline, it was not the language, or the map, or the ancient obligation to a house in the London fog. It was this. The knowledge that somewhere in the world there is always someone grieving alone for too long. Someone who has turned their chair to face the window. Someone who keeps a drawer closed because opening it costs more than they believe they can afford. What is needed, the only thing that has ever been needed, is not a solution, not a rescue, not someone who arrives with answers already prepared. Only someone willing to sit across from the grief, to set something warm on the table between them, to wait, without rushing, until the other person is ready to open it. That is the whole inheritance. That is what gets passed down. This story reminds us of something simple that is very easy to forget. The people carrying the longest grief are usually the ones who stopped asking for company. They decided, somewhere along the way, that they had become too much to sit with. If someone in your life has gone quiet, a neighbor whose porch light no longer comes on, a sibling you have not called since the last family gathering, a friend whose voicemails you keep meaning to return, you do not need the right words. This week, show up with something small and specific. The recipe you both used to make at Christmas, the photograph from that trip in 1987, his favorite coffee mug you still have not moved from the cabinet. Set it on the table between you. Do not explain it. Just stay. You already know who that person is. You have been thinking about them since this story started. If this story moved something in you, drop 1 word in the comments, just 1 word for whatever you are carrying today. You do not have to explain it. The author is a flesh and blood human who spent hours living alongside these vampire characters. It was a real person who cried, felt fear, and trembled while writing every line. AI merely provided gentle assistance to make the story flow smoother and more captivating.